collection of talks on Nokodemion's teaching from Contact Reports from 777.
Contact Report 723 speech from Nadista to all FIGU members.
My name is Nadista, and I have to greet you, Edward Billy, as our friend and herald, in the name of our committee and our Playaran peoples, and to express our thanks to you, as I also have to pay our greetings to all members of the FIGU core group and all Earthwide passive group members on behalf of our body. I also have to honorably thank, on behalf of our body, all the members of all the group communities who are working freely and honorably in friendship with our common herald as contributors with their commitment to his mission. I, Nadista, I'm not yet fully conversant in your language, and I am speaking through a converter, and I have to do my duty and tell you that in the name of the body and by means of an obligatory regulation of our directives, I have been allowed to address a few words in an open manner to all members of the FIGU Mondial community in the name of all our Playaran peoples. This is to pay you all our great thanks for your much appreciated work of every kind and nature that you take upon yourselves, and perform for the mission of our proclaimer, and also for us and yourselves. I also have to express our special thanks to all of you from the core group, the passive group, and from all the study groups, national groups, and the FIGU circle of friends for your loyalty to our herald, and for your untiring and extensive efforts to assist him to the best of your ability, through which your help also arises for us Playaran peoples, who have had to wait since time immemorial, as have our ancestors, to be instructed in the teaching of the truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of the life, by the foretold messenger from the lineage of the ancient herald Nokodemion. All of us of the body as well as our peoples express our thanks to all of you for trusting and being helpful to our herald, and also learning, whereby he can be our herald, not only for you, but also for us Playaran. We also thank you for your special loyalty to him, and also for learning and following the immeasurable value of the teaching of the truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life, and also for your efforts to pass on this teaching, which is unrestrictedly valid throughout creation, in order to spread it among the peoples of the earth. I also pay my personal thanks to all of you, for I and all of us Playaran also need the teachings of the primordial herald Nokodemion, and we can only receive them through our present herald. And this is also only because you all use your efforts and helpfully assist him in your knowledge that his mission is that of love and harmony, peace, and the principle of life. You all have to bear in mind that our messenger can only fulfill his difficult task together with you and your commitment and protection against all opponents of religious truth-false beliefs, and through know-it-alls, lies and slander of evil-minded earth humans, and through their insults, threats, and attacks against his word and life, and many repulsions directed against his mission. Selflessly and without gaining material values, he strives on your world for the whole of humanity and its welfare, its peace, its personal independence, and its freedom and future, as he also teaches this for us Playaran. He does not seek reward or promotion, nor does he seek might and titles of any kind. And as you all from the core group, all passive groups and study groups, make your obligatory coin settlements, and also contribute voluntarily, but required non-obligatory coins.
So also he empties his coin bag in all necessary ways more than anyone else for the task of his mission, for its existence and its success.
And so, as you all also contribute everything to the mission's success in expanding and spreading out into the far reaches of the earth, and also to us Playaran. Be thankful for this in the name of our body and all our Playaran peoples, for it is only through the cooperation of all of you that it is possible for our herald to be able to offer the teaching of the truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life to us Playaran as well, in an unfoldment especially prepared for us. So, in the name of our body and all our Plejaran peoples, I have to thank you for all the help you are giving to our messenger. Thank you. It has been a pleasure for me, Nadista, to speak to you and to greet you, and also to express our thanks to you. Be thankful for your trust in our herald. Thank you again, thank you, and it has been my honor.
What Yanarara begins, she also finishes correctly. Of course, you can use what Nadista spoke into your device, and which our language experts formulated for her in our present place of conversation, when you retrieve our conversation and also write it. But now, Edouard, dear friend, I want to talk about what has been moving me for some weeks. As you know, I have been preoccupied with my father Svath's notes and with the new library, especially in the last few weeks, which is also why I have not come here. And because you have opened the Sphere Library to us, we have gained extremely extensive knowledge, which on the one hand goes back millions and billions of years, but on the other hand gives us insights, knowledge, education, and much more on a scale we could never have hoped for. Now I want to talk about the fact that I can only now understand what a great task my father Svath took upon himself and fulfilled, but about which he also had to keep silent towards us, just as you also had to keep silent about many things, which is why you also kept silent towards me and all of us all these years. This gave me the impression, in many respects, as I also had with my daughter, Simya-se, and with Quetzal, which the three of us also sometimes talked about, that we had to give you explanations and exemplifications for your understanding in certain matters, individual things, facts and incidents, etc., and this was not infrequently the case. Although you had more precise knowledge of what we were explaining, and you even often knew more than we did ourselves, and about this I would like to discuss a few things with you after our official conversation and stipulate that you should call up and officially also write down what I have to say so far, and also now. In this regard, my father Svath has stated in his annals that you would do this and have given your word to do so. Once I have read through and studied all his records completely, and thus also received all the necessary information. Since we have been in contact with you, I have come to know you as my true, honest, and personal friend. But I only know today that you nevertheless concealed a great deal from me, which I actually did not know, and also never noticed that you knew more than me on various occasions, but did not let this show. This is precisely because you gave your word to my father as a boy to keep silent towards me until I myself became aware of this fact by studying his annals. All this is now so, and thus I can understand your silence and see nothing wrong behind it against me. That your silence is of many kinds, as well as that you had to test us in many ways on my father's behalf by your pretense of ignorance and by certain questions. That I can also understand, for through this we, especially my daughter Simya-se, Quetzal and I, have grown into our task and have also dutifully kept to our directives. Edouard, dear friend, with regard to the observance of the directives, this also concerns, for example, everything around the Earth foreigners, the future ones and the earthly ones who have always appeared with their flying apparatuses since ancient times are doing so at present and will continue to do so. Neither about the Earth foreigners and Earth future ones, nor of the earthly ones was exact information found in the annals, just as no information was contained therein with regard to many of your questions. This was also true with regard to abductions of Earth humans by Earth foreigners, whereby such abductions were foreign to us, because we have always not cared about them and never made ourselves recognizable to them, and only in the course of the years were able to clarify these things through your questions, and so on. And we did not let ourselves be recognized by them all because, Already at the beginning of my father's annals, it was clearly warned against ever coming into contact with the Earth foreigners and the future ones, just as we should also never penetrate into the direct range of their flying apparatus. Likewise, he warned in his annals not to come into contact with the Earthlings and with their equally futuristic flying apparatus, just as we are also to keep away from all their underground bases and underwater stations. And that my father has recorded much in his annals, but has also warned us against contacting the aliens, who probably also do not maintain contact with each other or have no knowledge of each other, as it seems to us, but there is no mention of this in the annals. The fact is that 3 groupings of aliens are on Earth, and that all the occurrences and certain related occurrences that have taken place since time immemorial and the appearance of innumerable unknown flying objects of alien life forms correspond to reality. You, however, knew all this in detail, but kept silent about it also to us and pretended to be ignorant, because you were not allowed to speak, and you kept to what you were obliged to do. And I now know that you will continue to keep this obligation, because that is now completely clear to me, although I have also become aware that it would be dangerous not only for you, but also for Earth humans if you were to announce any facts about this, which must continue to remain unspoken for a long time. And this does not only refer to the real facts concerning all groups of aliens with their flying apparatuses, but also to the future of the Earth and its humanity, which unfortunately has not listened to your warnings since the 1940s and is leading the climate towards a collapse, as you and my father have observed in present and future times, whereby the unreasonableness of this Earth human being, blinded by a delusion of a supposed God-creator, has already irrevocably destroyed, annihilated, and exterminated a great deal of the Earth and its entire nature. But what I want to say with regard to our behavior towards you was the result of our ignorance of all the missing knowledge. For this has only now been granted to us, in that you have opened the great spherical library to us, as this opening had been foretold to us for 212 millions of years, that it would one day take place through a successor personality of the Annunciator Nokodemion. Our ancient prediction contained only the announcement that in the distant future, in a very distant descendant, a sage of our lineage from the lineage of Nokodemion would find the new herald, and he would bring the teaching of Nokodemion. Now that through you we have access to the new, great and ancient library that you have opened to us, I have found in an instruction found in the library the complete ancient prediction and have studied it. It says that the new herald for us Pleiaren is not to be found in our reality, but in another. This new herald, so the prediction reads, will not appear in our reality, but in another reality that is foreign to our space-time structure, and will bring us Pleiaren, the teachings of Nokodemion, anew. However, there will be a wise man from the peoples of the Pleiaren who will find him, teach him, and prepare him for his path and his far-reaching task. And this sage was undoubtedly my father Svath, of which, apart from himself, no one knew anything. So not even we descendants, because he had to keep silent, for which the reason was also given. Only through the entire explanations of the prediction did I now become aware of the implications of it all, and that also only because I was able to find knowledge and explanations in the great library that had been opened, which already at the beginning revealed to me a knowledge that I could not yet grasp and that must be immeasurable. The information, insights, explanations, and knowledge I have gained in the last only 1.5 months alone far surpasses anything I could ever have imagined. In the same way, this will also apply to our entire spiritual leadership and also to all our peoples, whom we will officially let participate in everything. Consequently, we will open up all the information and insights, etc., which we continuously gain from the library to all peoples, on all our planets and to all their peoples, to all persons who are interested in it. The interest in this is, of course, individual, so not all individuals of all peoples are interested, as it is also with regard to other things, but it is the absolute majority of every people who are interested in all the far-reaching facts and connections of our billions of years of Pleiaren history. But as for the teaching of the truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, which you have been producing for us for years, it is of very special interest to all peoples, which is why there is not a person who has not turned to it since you made it available to us, Pleiaren, which has been the case for nearly 50 years now and has penetrated all our peoples down to the last person, as is undoubtedly the case. But as far as we are concerned, all of us who were in contact with you after my father's departure and who are in contact with you today, so also Asket and Nera, we are all agreed that, I must say, we have actually misled ourselves about your personality. Because first of all, we aligned ourselves very precisely with our directives and refrained from any enlightenment about your personality. This is because we saw no right in doing so, as this also applies to every other person whose personality and private sphere must remain inviolable for us, as our directives stipulate and we follow them, as this is observed without exception by all our Pleiaren peoples, down to the last person. Consequently, quarrels are unknown everywhere, as on the contrary is disgracefully the case with the Earth humans, as a result of which discord, hatred, and violence prevail all around and very often mischief is caused. But just as we have restrained ourselves with regard to your person, so we have also done in other respects, such as, for example, towards the Earth foreigners and rare Earth future beings, who since time immemorial have made themselves known on Earth again and again with their flying apparatus, just as the earthly powers in this respect have also done. But we will continue to do so, because this is determined by our directives, which is why we do not know too much about these groupings. But this is also good for us, because in this way we do not run the risk of being confronted with anything that could force us to take defensive measures and relapse into the same warlike behavior as was the case more than 52,000 years ago with our ancestors of that time. And since we now know, especially I through my father's annals, that you have much better knowledge of these three foreign forces than we have, because we have always been careful not to make ourselves recognizable to them, and will also avoid doing so in the future, I have the wish to receive more detailed information from you. But according to everything I have read in my father's annals, it was correct that we never let ourselves be recognized by these alien flying objects. Although we did well to keep a low profile and not to make ourselves recognizable to the aliens, on the other hand, we did not gain any knowledge that might have been of importance to us. I must also mention that you were not allowed to talk about the connections with the flying apparatuses, about which you always pretended to be ignorant, and also asked questions as if you were completely ignorant, although you had much more knowledge about everything than we did. Nevertheless, it was correct that you remained silent, as you were instructed to do by my father, because in this way we learned to protect ourselves and also came to insights that were important for us. Your lifelong silence, which you have to keep in this respect, corresponds in my opinion to something, and also in many other matters, which actually a human being cannot keep, because probably everyone would sooner or later lose control over it and speak carelessly, and therefore unintentionally. Meier.
Contact Report 724.
I am interested in that, so I will read it then. But first I would like to say that I am very surprised how much more you know about the strangers on Earth and elsewhere than I and all us Pleiaren have known up to now. This is evident from further annals of my father, which we have in the meantime found in his legacy hitherto closed to us, the seal of which opened independently after your last appearance with us, which we cannot explain. Through the opening of the seal, however, we have now gained new and extremely astonishing information, and now know that after my father's departure, we neglected various things that would have been important to do, because we did not know what task he really had to fulfill, how very extensive this was, and his entire knowledge with regard to manifold things, which he also taught you. And the main neglect that affects us Plearan as a whole as a planet-wide population has been our lack of effort in relation to more intensive learning, following an adherence to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the creation energy, teaching of the life. It was only through your efforts in bringing the teaching back to our minds in an understandable way that we were reawakened and actively encouraged to learn and adhere to all the necessary values, which were slowly and steadily becoming more careless, energetic, indifferent, and apathetic over the ages. However, through your efforts, through your untiring work of the new elaboration of the teaching, which we spread and taught in all our nations, everything changed very quickly. Consequently, in only about 45 years, a state was reached which corresponds again to that when the teaching was in full bloom. In addition to all the positive things that have come about among all our peoples as a result of the efforts of your doctrine reconstitution, our knowledge is now also being expanded in many respects through the opening of my father's secret legacy. For already all the knowledge that we have gained through my father's secret annals in the last few weeks is yielding extremely important insights for us, such as, for example, with regard to the existence of the many kinds of aliens who have been working on Earth since time immemorial, about which you also have much better knowledge than we do. This is precisely because my father Svath also taught you about this. But you not only had to keep silent about it to us, but the Earth humans were also involved in this way and must also remain so. But for this purpose, according to his records, you are commissioned by him to initiate us into this knowledge when the time shall be ripe for it, whereby, however, this is to be determined by you.
Yes, I know. And this time refers to the fact that I am to explain to you, and thus to you, all that which Svath, as a confidant, has instructed me to communicate to you for the preservation of your peaceableness, the time being when you will again find your way comprehensively to the observance of the teaching. And that is indeed what has happened.
Contact Report 728.
I can also only say that this is primarily due to the stupidity of the organizers and all those taking part in such events, because they want to appear great and humane in front of the people, but can neither guess nor understand what evil they are thereby conjuring up. Such stupid and ill-considered commemorative events were also common among our Plearan peoples in earlier times, namely 53,000 years ago, before final peace and humanity finally dissolved all evils. Then, however, a profound psychological insight and instruction of a denunciation led to a complete cessation and a comprehensive prohibition of further such commemorations. Basically, the psychological insights into such commemorations prove that in some ways they trigger exactly the opposite of commemoration and peace, as well as forgiveness and forgetting, because in remembrance of earlier malicious events, they evoke hateful emotions in former victims and their descendants and sympathizers, as well as in extreme dissident groups, for example, neo-Nazis. However, this is also the case with other persons who support those things, machinations and crimes, etc., for which the commemorations are organized. This creates acts of hatred and violence, and thus all the more the opposite of what is stupidly and falsely expected and intended from such events. Since the organizers and fellow travelers of such commemorations are largely psychologically uneducated, which also applies to the majority of all earthly psychologists themselves, who believe themselves to be God. The truth in this respect is neither accepted nor understood. Consequently, hate and malicious actions, deeds, violence and destruction, etc., continue to be provoked in a very stupid way among extremists who think differently. This is in addition to the fact that through such commemorations, various commercial interests are abused for profit, and the participants of the events are financially robbed. As far as the change is concerned, according to earthly chronology, it occurred 61,000 years before, a little more than 52,000 years ago. The great spherical object known to you traveled around our worlds for 32 days each, and through its vibrational influence, all our peoples were pacified. This pacification event was preceded, however, by a general change of ratio in all our peoples through the teachings of a personality from the direct lineage of the primordial herald Nokodemion, who was highly respected, but only after our peoples, who at that time were still stubborn and bound to violence, accepted her teachings and began to follow them. And just as our humanities on all worlds looked up to their herald then, I myself also have the same honor and reverence to witness today.
Ta, please do not do that. You know I do not like that. So please. Please, Ta, please. We are friends and damn it. Please go on about what other information you dug up in the new library. Please.
Excuse me, dear friend, excuse me, I did not mean to. Good. I have only gained the information mentioned earlier in the last few days through records in the new orb library, for it was unknown to me, as it was to all our peoples, until a few days ago, which is why the new knowledge is already being spread to all our worlds, as is our custom when new information arises. All our peoples are very interested in this matter and want to know what can be found in the new library. The new knowledge I have been able to acquire in this respect also shows that it was only through the ratio Wandel, which took place 61,000 years ago before the pacification more than 52,000 years ago. I calculated back from the present time about 113,000 years ago that the triggering factor was created for all the human beings of our worlds to come to their senses. And this reflection was such that all the Play-Aran peoples on all our worlds accepted the teachings of our Annunciator and allowed themselves to be guided by reason or by understanding and reason in such a way that a change came about within them in a positive and progressive way, according to the chronistic records. However, this only gradually came to fruition when the majority of the peoples realized that all his degenerations were fundamentally founded in his religious faith, and that his thoughts, actions, deeds, and behavior, etc., arose over and over again from his faith. However, only when they realized this did they also realize that their faith in God was so deeply rooted in them that all their degenerations, all their thoughts, actions, and behavior were not consciously controlled by them, but insidiously unconsciously through their religious delusion. This realization caused a far-reaching shock reaction in the majority of all peoples and the perception of the effective real reality, whereby they finally realized their degrading degenerations and were able to define them in the course of time, which was impossible for them before, because everything happened completely unconsciously through their delusion and thus in the name of God. This realization led to the perception of their false and misleading religious faith dependence with regard to reality and truth, and to the realization that their views, opinions, and considerations were always unconsciously, without being able to determine this themselves, influenced by their faith and arising from their delusion in this respect. This led to the fact that the old Play-Aran peoples gradually began to think consciously for themselves, to consider and thereby also to decide for themselves. Consequently, they thereby became free in themselves and discarded their belief in a deity and everything connected with it. In the course of time, which lasted for thousands of years, they thus gained complete independence and freedom and finally detached themselves from all religious faith, which, as on earth, had brought religious wars, religious persecutions, hatred, murder, degenerations, destruction, and for many millennia, endless misfortune to all peoples as a result of religious fanaticism. By finally renouncing all delusional belief in deities and forbidding all religious cults, an awareness of the knowledge of the doctrine of creation, which you teach here on earth and call the doctrine of truth, the doctrine of the energy of creation, the doctrine of life, developed in our peoples during the next 61,000 years. Through the teaching, profound positive changes took place in all peoples on all our worlds in relation to a consistent use of intellect, reason, and an effective, true humanity, consequently also a self-improving ability for controlled and further development of the intellect emerged. This also led to the opposing of everything that was not right, such as all hatred, all violence and criminality, all terrorist organizations and all organizations of crime, which existed among the earlier Playaran peoples, just as such have existed on Earth for a very long time. All these degenerations had therefore to be ended by the will of the peoples wherever there still existed unteachable people who, in spite of all the changes of the majority of the peoples, remained in their old degenerations and did not care for any teachings but continued to do their mischief. Thus, on a planetary scale, the majority of all peoples of all worlds put an end to everything in comprehensive actions and thus a re-emergence of the whole of these misanthropic degenerations was prevented for all times. By then, and so was.
Contact Report 754.
Good, so your word is in my ear. And so I will now, for once, talk about what happened in Mesopotamia at that time, which means that I will not say anything more about Hinduism, but I will look for and find some explanations about it in Wikipedia, which I will then add to this subject at the point where you interrupted me earlier in my explanations. But before I tell you something of what you want to hear and know, I want to clarify the following. What has led to alleged cultural encounters and experiences since time immemorial? These have in fact never taken place. But first this, that in the ancient early times, by which I mean between 4,000 and about 6,000 years ago, then unfortunately effective religions arose, which as a rule were related to polytheism, whereby the religious worship of a multitude of deities or different gods and goddesses applied, as well as nature spirits and human beings who were worshipped as deities, which idiotically is still done in various ways today. Most of the religions of antiquity, which, according to what I have seen and experienced, goes back about 6,000 years, were polytheistic, whereby these faiths had worlds of gods that often emerged with figures from centuries-old traditions of persons who had originally lived. In the course of time, however, these traditions were more and more frequently embellished with what had supposedly happened, and fantasies were also invented, which were additionally embellished by constantly new additions to fairy tales, and persons were also beamed up to saintly figures, so that in the end the whole thing corresponded only to complete unreality. This is also what happened in the form of signs, stone writings, stone pictures, sculptures and writings, and which today is taken at face value by scientists and is no longer questioned, which not infrequently leads to scientifically proven assertions that do not correspond to real reality and truth, such as the lies, deceptions, and slander regarding the alleged and never-made statements and teachings of Emmanuel Jesus and Muhammad. Also facts of a purely historical nature that have been recorded in writing, such as in chronicles, etc., are taken at face value by all genres of historians, religionists, philosophers, and other so-called scholars and scientists, and are not questioned as to their real truth. Thus, it is not even taken into consideration that all the old and ancient characters, writings, sculptures and descriptions, etc., that still exist today, which are carved in stone, recorded on animal skins, tree bark, or papyrus, etc., and which possibly go back far beyond the time of antiquity, were created by human beings. This was done by earthlings who made everything according to their own understanding, evaluation and interpretation, and consequently recorded and made things and facts in such a way that they interpreted, understood, imagined, and adjusted them for themselves from their own personal point of view. And that is how it has remained up to the present time. Consequently, it is still the case today, and will remain so in the future, which can be proven nowadays in every reference book, in every newspaper article, in every TV and radio program, and everywhere else on a daily basis, because the personal touch of the earthling in question is recorded and recognizable without fail in everything and everything, as it applies solely and exclusively to him. With this is also said what, in my opinion, is necessary for the understanding of all my explanations, where actually nothing more needs to be explained. But now to what you want to know. Buddhism as a present-day teaching emerged from the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, which he spread as the teaching, or the Dharma, although his original teachings were of a different kind than those presented by present-day Buddhism. The original teaching was absolutely opposed to Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, etc., just as it does not correspond to any theistic religion or theistic sect, and is therefore in no way oriented towards the centralization of the worship of an omnipotent God. But if I now have to speak about Buddhism, then this requires longer and also several repetitive explanations, because the whole of this is quite extensive, and for a more precise explanation, digressions are unavoidable. But listen to all that is to be said and explained. In its original form, the teaching was neither a faith, a religion, nor a philosophy, let alone a sect. For in truth, the primal teaching was a valuable guide which offered many human beings reliable ways of finding themselves, of controlling themselves in all conceivable things, and of making true independent human beings of themselves, who could also help themselves, free themselves from evil situations in life, and build themselves up. It was a primordial teaching that showed reliable ways by which willing human beings, if they followed the teaching, found inner and outer peace, and did everything to free themselves from all outer misery through their own efforts and to become true human beings. So the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama at that time was also about, as today with the teaching of spirit, or teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, what the Pleiadian Cladena Icarina, at the age of 11, called the silent revolution of truth, promoting and maturing a development of consciousness in human beings, so that they could build up and use their own true abilities and help themselves. This was the basis of the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, called Buddha by the people, whose life story, teachings, and his work, etc., were already completely falsified during his lifetime by antagonists, know-it-alls, misinterpretations, and sect founders, in order to be falsified even further after his death, whereby splinterings from the original teaching also took place, which can be called Buddhist sects, because the basic teachings of Siddhartha Gautama have been changed and distorted to the point of hatred against fellow human beings and those of other faiths, resulting in persecution, expulsion, murder, manslaughter, massacre, destruction, and war. The best proof of this is to be found in Burma today, where the Islamophobic, radical, Burmese Buddhist sect of the monk Ashin Wirathu in Myanmar tyrannizes the large Islamic part of the population and drives them out of the country by the military, whereby murder and manslaughter are also commonplace. On the other hand, among other Buddhist groups that have degenerated is also Lamism in Tibet, as well as the form of Buddhism that is widespread in Mongolian and Manchu Tungusian cultural circles, but also in Bhutan, Sikkim, and Ladakh. If only the Buddhist sectarianism of Lamaism in Tibet is examined, it reveals the same evil as in Myanmar, for what the lamas and Panchen lamas have done there would knock Siddhartha Gautama's hat off his head, and he would turn over in his grave in disgust. Shame and pain note Wikipedia. Panchen Lama is the title of an important reincarnation lineage of the Gelug order in Tibetan Buddhism. The Panchen Lama is considered the second highest Trulku of the Gelugpa, and traditionally the emanation of the Buddha of immeasurable light, Amitabha. If I were to describe the atrocities of Lamism in Tibet alone, I would have to write several books about it, but I can recommend a book that shows some of what has become of Buddhist sects that practice completely false teachings of Buddhism that have absolutely no real connection to the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama anymore. To gain a really clear insight into yesterday's and today's Buddhist sects, especially Lamism and its Panchen Lama, as well as the equally mendacious Dalai Lama Tenzin Gyatso note, today's Dalai Lama, who is especially adored by women, although he despises and hates them abysmally. I wonder why. The book The Shadow of the Dalai Lama by Victor and Victoria Tremondi, Patmos Verlag, Dusseldorf is recommended. The real life and work of Siddhartha Gautama was effectively quite different from what is known today through completely false and slanderous traditions. He led a life in which meditation played a very important role for him, through which he always gained peace and harmony. But many things were different from what has allegedly been handed down, because he explained and told many things in an absolutely different way than the falsified traditions still present before and since his death. This is exactly the same as is the case with Emmanuel Kur and Muhammad, whose teachings and work etc. have been abysmally falsified in the course of time, and already during their lifetime as well as especially long after their death, and statements have been denied, fantasized, attributed to them in their mouths, and holy books have been made out of them, which are so full of ashen lies and slander that they cannot be surpassed by the greatest efforts. Asked about certain alleged true traditions that circulated in the 20th century, which were read to him, Siddhartha Gautama declared that much of it did not correspond to the truth, such as that for him from birth neither his life, wisdom, and specialness had been prophesied, nor his family had held a royal position. His family was not royal, but merely a small noble family, and his father a minor regent of the Shakya region. His own family consisted of his wife Yasodhara, a lowly noblewoman, his son Rahula, as well as 4 daughters named Hasita, Abhaya, Janana, and Gaurema, all of whom he loved and respected, although girls and women in his time were considered inferior and were treated as poor and worthless commodities. This, he said, corresponded to an abomination beyond compare and contradicted the entire sweeping beliefs of Hinduism which prevailed everywhere, which he could not get over, for he considered both human sexes equally valuable, though he rather respected the female a little more because she was the life-giving and life-sustaining one, without whom no life could be born and exist. Well, the fact is that the 4 daughters of Siddhartha Gautama were not and are not mentioned in any of the traditions. Siddhartha explained that they were not mentioned by the writers of the traditions who wrote about him and his life, because young girls and women in his time were disregarded and not appreciated, but often abducted and held captive in Vaishyavasa brothels and sooner or later murdered. But as it was then in Nepal and in India, so it is also today, as I myself have witnessed in India and Nepal over a long period of time. Siddhartha often left his family for days or weeks at a time and for 28 years wandered the countryside as an ascet, teaching the human beings, teaching them his method of meditation and how to find and understand the meaning of life, and also that no God would help them because there was no God, so that they would only have to help themselves and free themselves from all illnesses, suffering, strokes of fate, and from all evil and misfortune. He had not been an ascetic for such a long time, had not left his family as has been falsely handed down, and according to his explanation, he also did not use the teachings of other sages and experienced human beings, but only his own insights, experiences, and personal experience, which he clearly and unambiguously expressed. This, as he also clearly stated that he only practiced his own meditation and went his own way with regard to everything and anything, and sought the truth of all things himself, evaluated it and gained in-depth knowledge and a far-reaching understanding of all things from it. He alone found and recognized the connections of all the necessary things of life, and made himself a knower and a sage. This made him inwardly free of desires and the desire to be more than his fellow human beings. Therefore, it was also not convenient and embarrassed him when he was always met with great veneration and devotion by human beings from different social classes, and when he was called a human being with great enlightenment. He often had to defend himself against this, as he sheepishly explained, but all his defensiveness never worked, and he could not get rid of his reputation as Buddha, which was embarrassing to him, and he would be grateful if he could get rid of this reputation. Furthermore, he had to constantly resist creating a large community to expand his teachings as a basis, because that was not in his mind. He certainly had a few faithful of both sexes who were constantly around him and who would look after many followers of his teaching, but he did not want to do anything further in this direction, but rather keep the whole thing as an open learning community, because otherwise a movement of believers, faith organization or religion, would arise from it, which, however, did not correspond to his sense. Unfortunately, this could not be prevented, as was the case with Emmanuel and Mohammed. So Siddhartha did not found a religious community, as is being mendaciously claimed, because he gave his speeches openly and without a religious organization to individual human beings or small groups. Consequently, he was able to win over people of different social classes in this way, from which something like a school of doctrinal tradition developed, which for many became a doctrine of life, as also results from the Figu with the doctrine of truth, doctrine of creation energy, doctrine of life. However, the whole thing aroused envy, enemies as well as evil adversaries already during his lifetime, who called him a liar and a fraud, falsified the teaching, cursed Siddhartha, and used him as a conspiracy theory to make his teaching impossible. This, while advocates and know-it-alls also glorified his whole work and his personality during his lifetime, and even more so after his death, or falsified his original teachings according to their own judgment and understanding, as the last example proves, or rather the falsified work of interpretation of lies, which today is spread worldwide beyond Siddhartha and all truth facts, and is foisted as a work of lies and slander on all Buddhists, as the real original teachings of Buddha or Dharma. In the course of time, the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha were completely changed and no longer correspond to the original teachings, because they were very strongly mixed with other religious and sectarian false teachings, customs and rites, etc., especially with those that were native to China, Tibet, and Japan as religions and are still largely so today. As far as the teachings of Siddhartha are concerned, I must mention that they correspond to a way of life that has various principles, one of which clearly states that non-violence or ahimsa should prevail among all human beings. This non-violence was also originally prevalent in Hinduism and Jainism, and was also included by Siddhartha in his teachings. And he did this, as he explained, which was completely correct, and which is also fundamentally represented and taught by our Figu with the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, because he saw how the human beings and all living beings were mistreated wickedly and violently by the rulers and the people against the rules of Hinduism and Jainism, and consequently also human beings were killed by all kinds of incidents. And this also happened with regard to many other living beings who were killed senselessly and only for pleasure, etc. And this was the reason for him to list in his teachings an ethical or between good and evil distinguishing action and behavior, which was indispensable and to be followed in order to be a just and true human being. And in this important rule to be observed and also to be fulfilled by human beings, as Siddhartha expressly emphasized, which I still remember well, it was also included that a very special attention and mindfulness was to be paid to all value attitudes in order to give satisfaction to the perception of responsibility, integrity, as well as sustainability with regard to the necessary respect. This is the only way to ensure justice, transparency, and the cooperative coexistence of human beings, and, in particular, the bearing of joint responsibility for general group-related and public and social concerns and needs, etc. The whole thing is to be done in full. The whole thing is fully and inevitably important, because only through this can the functioning of all ecosystems, the planet, nature, and all its living beings of all genera and species of fauna and flora be guaranteed. Only ethical action makes the functioning of the whole of all living things possible, but it requires compassion, attention, and mindfulness, good moral discipline as well as inclination, participation, consideration, and familiarity, esteem and respect for human beings, as well as for everything that exists. The teaching of nonviolence or ahimsa, as it was interpreted and taught by Siddhartha Gautama in his original teaching, but as it is also taught by us in the Figu through the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, is geared towards the fact that no infliction of suffering or coercion, as well as no pain and no violence at all, should take place against any human beings, neither against humans nor animals or other living beings. Violence in the form of suffering, coercion, and pain should also not be inflicted on human beings through punishment such as torture, chastisement, or death, nor in the natural world of fauna and flora, as in hunting, catching fish, animals and birds, etc., nor through the destruction, annihilation, and extermination of fauna and flora life forms. This doctrine of nonviolence was already held in this way in the first still unwritten Hindu codes of conduct, which were spread, taught, and followed by human beings as far away as Mesopotamia, before a change caused everything to fall into disrepair, when this principle received less and less attention and finally fell into oblivion. Among Buddhists, too, this vow of nonviolence or ahimsa is nowadays, and indeed long before the modern era, which began in 1844, only a theory, because among many of today's Buddhists all over the world, following the rule of non-injury to human beings, animals, creatures, and other living beings of all kinds and species is no longer a duty, but a voluntary act. So this ancient rule is broken and no longer followed nowadays, just as the rule that neither injustice should be done nor hatred or jealousy cultivated, neither wars waged, nor terror and violence practiced, nor bad thoughts harbored towards other human beings, but also that human beings should neither be insulted nor maligned by lies, slander, or conspiracies, nor evil spoken of. The original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama are not only essentially different from today's Buddhism, but also from the great religions of Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism, as well as from all other small and larger god sects worldwide. But also today's still acceptable Buddhism, which still corresponds somewhat to the original teachings of Siddhartha, and neither to a religious doctrine nor to a sectarian doctrine, can still be halfway accepted, because it does not correspond in any way to a doctrine of God, a worldview doctrine, a philosophical doctrine, or any similar brainless belief-based doctrinal buildings. Consequently, the absolutely true original teaching, from which Buddhism arose, is in its effective origin, just as Siddhartha created and taught it, not a matter of faith or belief, but a teaching of the correct way of life, teaching of self-knowledge, teaching of experience, and teaching of self-development, with the aim of mental evolution and the use of understanding, reason, and correct mastery of life in every respect. Note: Siddhartha Gautama was born in Nepal in Lumbini in 563 BC as a Hindu whose biological mother was Maya, note, who is called Gutrulma in Tibet, but also Maya Devi and Mahamaya elsewhere, and biological father was the regent Shuddhodana Gautama. Siddhartha himself was married to Yasodhara and had a son with her, whom they named Rahula. Siddhartha Gautama died at the age of 80 years anno 483 BC at Kushinagar in India. As Siddhartha himself said, when he was 63 years old, already as a 14-year-old boy, he recognized through his observations a tremendous amount of misery, such as, among many other things, that very many human beings in all areas suffered from various diseases, as well as from loneliness or from terrible strokes of fate, lived in the most bitter poverty and starved, which all could only cope with difficulty. He further said that he had also observed how, in contrast to this, the healthy, well-fed and wealthy rich, contrary to all humanity, exploited the common people, kept many human beings as serfs, mistreated them, and were completely indifferent to all happenings, health problems, epidemic problems, hunger, and the general unworthiness of life. The rich and otherwise wealthy were said to be very spoiled human beings, afflicted with discontent, hatred, envy or greed, as well as with vices, addictions and pleasure-seeking, and many were also said to be completely afflicted with ruthlessness and lack of conscience towards the common people, indulging and doing only the very best for themselves, and bringing and spreading absolutely nothing but mischief to their fellow human beings. What Siddhartha told about this was indeed true, and continued for a long time before minor improvements occurred, but only as a result of parts of the population following his teachings, which he had worked out in 7 years and began to spread at the age of 21, after he had picked himself up by his own strength and use of intellect and reason, and learned a great deal. His newly created teachings led to better living conditions for many human beings who became his followers, as he said, while others, however, who did not make an effort to follow his teachings, became more and more rotten and lived a miserable existence in slums. Siddhartha explained that he had learned to teach and control himself by immersing himself deeply in meditative thought, through which he had found the path to himself, which, as a result of being called Buddha by his followers, he then called his teaching the Buddhist path. In this way and through his meditation, he had been able to find himself in his way, to free himself from all suffering, as well as to work out and create his teaching, through which he had also been able to expand the possibility of also being able to show human beings the way to a better life in the same way, so that they too could recognize themselves and their own power and ability, and find their way out of their suffering and lead a normal life again. This, at any rate, was his speech, according to which he also lived and led a modest life, also approaching his fellow human beings with sincere devotion, pleasing them, treating everyone equally and doing them good, without in any way judging them in terms of their religion, faith, appearance, social status, morality or behavior, etc., or despising them or treating them differently from anyone else in their dealings. The work and conduct of Siddhartha Gautama led him to further knowledge of many things, as a result of which, according to ancient belief and word, as I have already mentioned, he was called Buddha, or the Enlightened One by the people. Siddhartha Gautama also told that he taught the human beings in depth regarding many things, passed on his insights and experiences without asking for anything in return, and taught them his teachings so that they could educate themselves personally, individually, help themselves, and free themselves from their suffering, and lead a life worth living. Gratefully, however, he received from his followers voluntarily and without demand everything he needed for his livelihood, although he did not need this because he always had enough to live on from home. That was around 2,500 years ago, from which, because Siddhartha was called Buddha by the people, as I have just said, Buddhism arose, to which he himself did not contribute anything willingly, but unsuccessfully resisted it, as he explained. But what Siddhartha said and explained about the allegedly unadulterated traditions up to the modern times of the 20th century corresponds to nothing but lies, deceit and slander compared to all the known and alleged facts about his teachings and his life today. The greater part of all alleged traditions correspond in truth to unparalleled untruths, which, as Siddhartha himself expressed, correspond to an unpardonable shamefulness, just as Emmanuel Krur and Mohammed expressed themselves in a similar way about all that has been fabricated from their teachings by lies, falsifications, fraud, malice, misunderstanding and fanaticism, etc., and has led to a delusional religion of God. Siddhartha Gautama was completely shocked when he learned what would result from his original teaching in the future of the 20th century. But after he had learned the truth and also the day of his death, he decided during the last 17 years of his life to stand up for his teaching even more and even more vehemently, in order to possibly be able to prevent something even more detrimental. And as it is with the human beings of the earth, so it was also with Siddhartha, for he did not want to accept what was coming and held on to his opinion that he could still change some or even everything for the good and positive through his increased and more powerful commitment to spreading his teaching. This, although he said frankly, after he had experienced the facts of the future, that he himself had experienced in his life, and knew that already during his lifetime, falsifications of his teaching had circulated, and faith groups had arisen that spread his true teaching in a completely false, changed form and even teaching evil. Therefore, he could also understand that if in the future so-called true traditions were to apply to him and his teachings in the most evil way, they would no longer be more falsified than all the worst delusions. Buddhism, which first spread in Asia, in the Indus Valley and in Mesopotamia, and then also to other countries, found followers all over the world, and even today it is considered the fourth largest religion, although it is not such a religion. As already explained, Buddhism originally had nothing to do with religion and sex, which is why today, although it has little in common with the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, it is wrongly and completely misnamed as a religion, although, as with the original Hinduism, it was not a matter of faith and therefore not a religion or sect, but a teaching of the correct way of life. But that changed some time ago, which is the work of all the know-it-alls of the religious studies sign. As I have already mentioned, and I repeat again because it must be said clearly for once, it is unfortunately common among the earthlings that also in Buddhism, through know-it-all elements, secessions and thus sects have developed, which are of different views and opinions among themselves, and consequently also represent different doctrinal views, etc. The true doctrine taught by Siddhartha Gautama, as already explained, was not a theistic religion. In contrast to the great God and God delusionist organizations Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and consequently it is also in no way oriented towards a centralization of the worship of an all-powerful God. This alone distinguished Siddhartha's original teachings, from which Buddhism emerged, from the great religions of Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism, as well as from all other small and larger religions and God sects worldwide. The falsified Buddha teachings that are still circulating today, which Siddhartha did not teach in the way that has been falsely handed down today, correspond neither to a religious teaching, nor to a sectarian teaching, nor to a philosophical teaching, or to any similar belief-based doctrines. The true original teaching in its effective origin, as Siddhartha created and taught it, was not a matter of faith, as must be clearly stated and emphasized again and again, but a teaching of the correct way of life, teaching of self-awareness, and teaching of self-discovery, with the aim of the personal development of the cognitive abilities for the use of intellect, reason as well as self-knowledge and correct mastery of life in every correct relationship to life. Everything that human beings think and do creates good or bad effects. The human being must simply attain enlightenment in order to attain the correct insight in this regard as well, and thereby essentially live in real reality and its truth. However, make the correct decision, choose the correct word, make the correct speech, and give the correct answer. Do not lie, and do not hurt others by using wrong words. To observe the correct action at all times, to be honest and honorable and worthy, not to steal, not to cheat, not to slander and not to kill, as well as to pursue a correct livelihood in all ways, not to harm other living beings but to do good, and as said, to strive correctly for enlightenment, to direct the necessary attention and the correct mindfulness to the thoughts and the feelings. All this corresponds to the correct collection of many necessary values, which should always be kept present through meditation. The essence of Siddhartha Gautama's primordial teaching is to be summarized as profound thought work related to meditation in mindfulness and attention regarding the qualities of inner peace, as well as to harmony, righteousness, and to respect for life, love, righteousness, being human, and wisdom. However, what Siddhartha did not consider in his method of meditation, and also what has not been taught or its further values mentioned in any Buddhist meditation teachings, or elsewhere in other foreign teachings since then, is the mother of all meditations, which is the main factor of all learning, namely the actual meditation basic factor. Basic meditation factor. Permanent state. Daytime meditation. Daytime awake consciousness. Meditation. Apart from what is given to the whole of meditation practice with regard to meditation and its various methods, this refers to the daily, conscious and unconscious, not subconscious, steady state day meditation, which precedes all other meditations, but is unknown in all earthly meditation teachings since time immemorial. Consequently, it has also never been taught or spread. The permanent state of daytime meditation corresponds to a daytime awake consciousness meditation, which takes place in the course of the whole daytime in the daytime awake consciousness, which takes place both in lying, sitting, standing, walking, as well as in movement and every activity, and this both in a conscious and unconscious way, whereby the unconscious way corresponds to a level placed before the consciousness, which has nothing to do with the subconscious, but corresponds to a reception processing switching, reproduction level. Fundamentally, with regard to the continuous state day meditation in the day awake consciousness, the first and most important step of meditation is the day mindfulness attention continuous meditation. This is not only of particular importance to observe, but it is the most important meditation of all. This is because it results in the conscious and controlled cultivation of the constantly arising thoughts and the resulting feelings, which are concentratively occupied with everything and everyone that is currently being thought, created in feelings, what is being done, spoken, performed and handled, and what is being carried out in behavior, etc., through the continuous state daily meditation of the day awake consciousness, provided that this meditation is practiced willingly and consciously. Everything and anything is thoroughly controlled consciously and unconsciously, whereby everything that is done, acted upon, said, and handled is executed completely or at least largely correctly and without error. If in the course of the day or after the day's work the continuous state day meditation is interrupted in the day awake consciousness for a state of rest or a rest meditation, then a thought stop is necessary, whereby a dwelling in a meditation for rest can take place. But with that, just with all that has been said, it should now be enough, because I have some other things that I should also bring up. That will be so. To call on the people to take responsibility for themselves and to ask them to perceive, bear and fulfill their personal responsibility is pointless in the case of a large part of the people, because this part is completely lost in life and is blind to the reality of reality and its truth. Just as these human beings are delusional about God, they are also delusional about other insane delusional conspiracy theories, which they trust and emulate in their boundless stupidity, consequently trampling reality and truth underfoot. They do this by demonstrating extremist terror, and doing it like the degenerated neo-Nazi extremists they follow, but also similarly aping and emulating the cross-dumb demonstrators of the Fridays for Future, who are terrorizing and going crazy for something they have no idea about and don't know that it is exactly them who will continue to drive climate destruction in the future by breeding and giving birth to countless new earthlings to further increase overpopulation. And this results from the machinations of the earthlings with regard to their needs. Consequently, they destroy nature, its fauna and flora, all ecosystems and furthermore the climate in order to fulfill them, because through their machinations they produce endless, all-destroying greenhouse gases, which drive the climate into collapse. And the stupid ones do this until they possibly get themselves killed. Then I would like to return to the subject of conspiracy theories, which have been circulating among earthlings since time immemorial, some of which have persisted for centuries and millennia, such as the conspiracy theories of religions and sects with their madness of belief that a god and not the human beings themselves are the masters of their lives and destinies, and so on. This has also given rise to the army and military mania with its defense measures and insane armaments, whereby every armament and armament is a crime against humanity, peace, harmony, humanity, and righteousness, as well as against every single human being. Armies and militaries, like everything warlike, have emerged from the fear and revenge principle of God's doctrine of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And this has led to the fact that all around, from country to country, there is nothing but war mania, strife, the spreading of fear, threats, and warmongering, with the USA in the front line in this respect, greedy for world power and viciously war criminal. And when I say and reveal all this, it is not me who is important, but what must be said according to the truth, so that the human beings should learn to know what is really going on in the world. This also includes the fact that the Earthlings are unconscionably completely robbing the planet. Consequently, one day it will be hollow, empty, dead, a complete ruin, and absolutely lifeless. And so the thinking of the Earthlings is becoming more and more hollow and empty, as is their responsibility for life and their attitude to life itself. Consequently, they are becoming more and more cowardly and catapulting themselves out of existence and life when they fail and are too cowardly to cope with their life with all its ups and downs. Consequently, they then simply kill themselves. Or by buying their own murder in some way with horrendous sums of money and having themselves murdered by some legalized forms of murder with their help through poison, etc., because they have no life. Because they are cowardly, incapable of judgment, and completely irresponsible towards life. The mighty overgross of the earthly overpopulation Earthlings has completely forgotten that clear thinking, the thoughts of truth announce the reality of reality, while thoughts of faith are the unreality of the unreal. And the overgrows of overpopulation, above all the Fridays for Future freaks, are so stupid that they do not perceive and do not understand that the destruction of the climate and all the destruction of all ecosystems and all the exterminations and extinctions in nature and fauna and flora result solely from the machinations of the mass of overpopulation. Consequently, this overmass of humanity must be reduced enormously and drastically by a worldwide birth stop and by birth control. If I am harshly attacking the delusional believers in God in my remarks, as well as when I speak of stupid and dumb Earthlings, etc., then it must always be clearly understood in each individual case that I am not attacking any human being in his way, not in his honor and dignity, as well as not in his person, the human being not as a human being, as well as not in any other way in his freedom, not for the sake of his faith, in his personality, or in any other way as a human being. What I am attacking refers solely to what is wrong and unworthy from a logical point of view, and what is damaging to consciousness, as well as to pathological, completely senseless, irrational, and contradictory factors of thought, feeling, belief, action, and behavior that impair understanding and reason, nothing more and nothing less. Everything I mention under God delusionists and believers, etc., or in relation to any other moments, factors, things and things, etc., should, can, and must never be referred to and misunderstood in relation to a human being as a human being, as well as not to a person directly, and also not to the personality, etc. This is fundamentally not the case, because such an attack on a human being and on his person and personality is absolutely not in my sense, and also does not correspond to my nature. In any case, therefore, always and in every single case, only and only that aspect, that basic element or that point of view is addressed and meant in every naming of a factor. And indeed, however the form of speech is formulated as a result of the way of speaking, which as an effective basic moment clearly and distinctly puts the sorry factor to attack. If, therefore, the delusion of God itself is mentioned, attacked as idiotic, imbecilic, thoughtless or otherwise, and this also when it seems, or wants to be misunderstood, that I am thereby attacking the human being, as a person or his personality, then this does not correspond to correctness, but either to a misunderstanding, an incomprehension as a result of a lack of intelligentum, or roundly to a wicked and unjustified insult, etc. In the end, it must also be said that I do not attack any old true prophet, teacher, or herald, such as Emmanuel, Buddha, Abram, Confucius, or Muhammad, etc., nor any founder of a religion or sect, either as a human being or in his honor and dignity, or as a person or in his personality. If I raise my voice attacking the founders of religions or sects, it is not directed against the human beings, their person or personality, but only against their wrong actions, deeds, and false teachings and the spreading of their faith. Real prophets, teachers or heralds, such as Emmanuel lyingly called Jesus, Buddha, Abram, and Mohammed, whose true teachings have unfortunately been maliciously and slanderously falsified and refabricated into cult religions, are taboo and unassailable for me, just as I have also not attacked these true prophets, because all honor and dignity is due to them. Unfortunately, however, their true teachings have been abused and distorted and mutilated to such an extent that they have been misused for strife, hatred, revenge, retribution, torture, murder, war and terror, etc., since time immemorial. In truth, their effective and true, correct doctrine which they brought and taught was such that it corresponded to the honor and dignity and sanctity of all creative laws, which cannot be reconciled with an imaginary creator God.
You should put this entire statement as a preface to the discussion reports now to be published on the internets henceforth as an introduction to the front of the new forum.
Contact Report 766.
I know that only too well, because I have also had experiences in this regard several times throughout my life in various countries. But what you said about such paranormal occurrences was also explained to me once by the parapsychologist Professor Hans Bender, who said that he could not explain many things. Then, in the end, he never came back after such an experience here at the center. But thank you, my friend. To all that you have said, however, I would like to say and clarify the following. Even though I am fundamentally against any form of delusion of God and belief in salvation, as well as against everything that is wrong in terms of hatred, revenge, retaliation, everything that is evil and wrong, against violence and crime and everything that has degenerated, I will never condemn a human being for this, or disregard him as a human being if he is a slave to a religious belief. If someone follows an insane delusion of God or other beliefs, hates me for any reason, wants to take revenge on me, insults me, slanders me, curses me, or wants to murder me, all of which has happened often enough, then that is every human being's own business and damage. Everyone is responsible for this in his own stupidity, whereby stupidity, to explain it to people who do not know what stupidity is, corresponds to nothing other than a failure to think, that is to say that one does not think about something, a thing, etc., and does not fathom the truth, and therefore speaks, talks, scolds, acts, lies, slanders, condemns, and even hates, avenges and murders thoughtlessly and thoughtlessly. If a human being acts, speaks, and behaves in such a way, then he proves that he was and still is incapable in some way throughout his life of forming his own personality and character traits in a humanly good, clean, positive, and valuable manner. When human beings are shown their failures in this respect, their misconduct, their wrong actions, and their hatred, their vindictiveness, their retaliatory behavior, and their unhesitating faith, which is due to their boundless stupidity, that is to say, as a result of their absolute non-thinking, and this is therefore pointed out to them and ranted at, then they think and feel, of course again as a result of their stupidity, that is to say, their non-thinking, unjustly insulted and attacked as human beings. As far as a human being's faith of any kind is concerned, he can and should be allowed to believe what he wants, for everything in this respect is his own affair and matter alone, with which he alone must come to terms and cope with his life. Consequently, he makes himself worthy of respect or ridicule with what he does, believes, and makes, creates happiness or harm for himself and must live with it. So every human being should believe what he wants, because I do not condemn anyone because of that, but I only clearly expose to everyone what he is doing wrong in this respect. And if he thinks he is being attacked because he gets everything wrong and does not think about it, and thus proves his stupidity, that is to say, his non-thinking in order to see things correctly, then that is his business with which I have nothing to do. For my part, this is probably to be said again and again. I also do not accuse a human being as a human being, but only what he does wrong. If he believes and worships something that does not exist, or if he makes other serious mistakes that bring harm to him, or under certain circumstances also to other human beings, to the whole of humanity, or to the environment, the planet, the ecosystems, nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere and the climate. So I accuse the insane, the crazy and the wrong, as it is considered and understood as completely normal, of correctness by every human being who is powerful of common sense, reason and intelligentum. Consequently, only human beings who are inaccessible and closed to these values dare to doubt this effective fact and attack and insult me viciously with doubts, lies, and slander. Such persons, as well as those who, as a result of their boundless stupidity, listen to and believe liars and slanderers, and spread everything that is false and slanderous with faith and therefore thoughtlessly stupid verbally, electronically or in writing, etc., prove with their stupid stupidity that I am not a liar and slanderer. Prove with their stupid and stupid actions, and with their attacks, that they are making themselves liars and slanderers, precisely because they themselves are spreading lies and defamations that they only pick up from hearsay and spread into the world as mendacious truth. Now, believers in God and salvation, that is to say, simply believing human beings who resist real reality and cling to their faith, have never been and are no problem for me. Consequently, there is also no reason for me to condemn them as human beings. And with all the numerous persons who, despite their delusional faith, maintain a pleasant and appreciated contact with me, also people of other faiths as Christians, and know that I do not accept their act of faith and that I am an unbeliever for them, there are good and valuable interpersonal relationships, and relations that connect us among ourselves as human beings. And they all know that despite their belief in God, I value, respect, honor, and dignify them as human beings, otherwise our relationships could not exist. Our respect for each other suffers no damage through our differences, they with their faith, and I with the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, because for my part there is no reason for me to accommodate and mention the teaching with them, if I am not explicitly addressed by them for it, and am to give explanations. In such moments, I can then also speak openly about the teachings and also say, and explain everything clearly and neutrally, and accepted by the listeners, such as the erroneous belief in a God, God Creator, Godfather and an alleged Son of God, who was nothing other than an absolutely normal earthling and taught something clever, which, however, brought no benefit whatsoever, but on the contrary was used by pathologically stupid people to build up a crazy false doctrine and stupid sectarian religion, which has since then cost hundreds of millions of human lives and will also continue to claim many dead in the future, as was and will continue to be the case with all other religions and sects since their origin. However, I would like to say quite clearly that I am also not without fault and not omniscient, because I am also only a human being and have to learn during my lifetime, which means that I also make mistakes. Perhaps I know and understand a little more about one thing or another than is usual for human beings with a basic school education, but this does not make me more valuable as a human being than any other human being. Consequently, I also do not presume to want to place myself above my fellow human beings. Therefore, it is also not in my nature to judge others or to determine their weal and woe, which I also do not do when I rage about their wrongdoings, actions, inactions, lies and slander, as well as their attempts to murder my life, etc. Wisely, I always make an unstoppable effort to be truly human as a human being. Consequently, I also have no thoughts of hatred, revenge, or retaliation against any human being, for such is far from me. And this also with regard to those by whom I am insulted, denied, slandered, and hated, and who have so far carried out 23 attempts to kill me out of revenge or retaliation, partly in the presence of witnesses. All these persons, unfortunately, can testify that they waste their lives and learn nothing. Consequently, their intelligentum is also at such a low level that they can neither distinguish reality from unreality, truth from lies, nor slander from effective fact. But how can one explain this to a person who is, on the one hand, non-thinking, that is to say, as dumb as a brick, and, on the other hand, also suffers from such a low level of intelligentum that he is not even capable of recognizing his own ridiculousness? But enough of that. Now I would like to ask you to explain everything as simply as possible, and without technical terms, so that we lay people can also understand the whole of what you have to say, because we have no training as doctors, chemists, or virologists, or anything like that. Much has already been disclosed since November 2019, so there is no need to rehash it.
Contact Report 767.
Excuse me, I know what you are going to say, but I do not have the power to just stop people who are furious at the three from eventually doing what they just threatened to do. It was and is only possible for me to tell the agitated and angry callers that they should not act rashly and refrain from their intended actions, because they would be committing a crime, and that they should do as I did, namely, simply not take note of everything, not think about it, remain calm, not want to retaliate, and not want to take revenge. This, I always tell everyone, is the only correct thing to do, because human beings who are addicted to stupidity and hatred do not listen when they are told the real truth, but continue in their hatred in the same style. With stupid human beings, it is unfortunately the case that everything you say blows away in the wind, as if you were talking out into the vastness of a desert. What is said does not even reach their ears, let alone that in their stupidity they could think about it and find the truth if they heard what was said. The fact is, and I also explain this to the callers again and again, that on the one hand stupidity knows no bounds, which is why human beings afflicted with stupidity, who as a rule think they are big and clever in their beanpole stupidity, believe lies and slander without thinking, because they do not think, do not consider, but take everything at face value and then spread everything, whereby they themselves become liars and slanderers, which they do not notice, however, precisely as a result of their stupidity, as well as not noticing that they thereby harm themselves, make themselves impossible and ridiculous in their environment, and possibly also create enemies for themselves. I learned all this from Svath when I was a little boy, as well as that, whatever happens and whatever is done to me, I will never build up hatred or aversion against a human being, never harbor revenge or retaliation against a human being, or even put it into practice. Of course, throughout my life, I could and will defend myself against direct physical attacks, which could become unpleasant for attackers and cause physical injuries, but never in such a way that a life would or would have been endangered. So for me as a philanthropist, even if a human being hates my guts, which is only out of sheer stupidity and selfishness, I never show hatred or badness, nor do I take revenge or retaliate, because anything to the contrary, in any manner whatsoever, would be totally contrary to what I have learned from a very young age, and have built my life on it, and have also led and lived it in this manner. This explains against all the lies and slander of the three, who try to out themselves as honest persons, and try to push me into the dirt by lies and slander and make me impossible, because they cannot cope with themselves, cannot fulfill their lives according to their wishes, and therefore oppose me as malicious antagonists with lies and slander against all truth in order to make me impossible as an honest human being, but also to throw dirt on my work and the effective logical teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, also to slander it as a lie and to make it indiscountable.
Contact Report 780.
Unfortunately, this corresponds to the facts, which, however, the Earth humans do not want to admit, and besides, they do not give it any thought. Only very few make an effort to get to the bottom of things that arise in order to recognize and also really experience the effective truth. For this reason, the whole thing also does not find much resonance. Although you make great efforts to spread the real truth into the world through the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life. Only a very few Earth humans who are disposed to intellect and reason grasp and understand the meaning of the whole. But really, it is only those human beings who think their own thoughts about everything and anything. Consequently, they do not allow themselves to be influenced by a belief of a religious or other kind, in order to find the way to the teaching, from which they learn by cherishing profound thoughts themselves and working out the meaning of truth from it.
However, these human beings are to be sought worldwide, which is also my task, in addition to my usual work, to address these human beings with the teaching. Nowadays, however, the internet helps me to do this, which unfortunately was not the case in the past when my former personalities carried out this task. At that time, when, unfortunately, misunderstandings and distortions of what was really only half understood, because the listeners did not listen correctly or were biased by the old, the conventional, and thus by faith, religions and sects arose that quickly developed worldwide. Thanks to these misunderstandings and distortions of teaching, it has become possible for more and more misunderstandings and distortions to arise, which ultimately became delusions and fanaticism, and it has become increasingly difficult for the truth of the effective truth to penetrate the consciousness of human beings. On the contrary, through the increase of religious belief, consciousness became more and more believing in God and defensive against the truth. Consequently, the delusion arising from this became so powerful that it was even passed down genetically in a certain way and affected the mind and reason of human beings from birth. This became more and more pronounced and powerful in the course of the millennia, which today has become a roaring danger due to the mass of horrendous overpopulation and their religious faith. This in the sense that different believers threaten and endanger each other, with Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Judaism in particular, with their special sects, bent on inflicting harm, destruction, and death on those of other faiths. This, while Buddhism and Shintoism as well as the other and sectarian faith communities pretend to be peaceful, or semi-peaceful. But through religion alone, the sword of Damocles of faith constantly hangs over earthly humanity, because fundamentally, in every war and in countless many murders and manslaughters, as well as hatred, there is always a faith in the foreground. If not a religious one, then just another one. Also, jealousy is based on a belief. Also, envy and other favoritism, ill will, every mimesis, that is to say, imitation of fellow human beings, etc.
This is correct. As you know, we are not allowed to enter our great library, but we are given the opportunity to obtain any information from it if we feel we need it. So I learned that today your task is to address the Earth humans via the internet through certain information given in the form of conversations, etc., but also in the form of treatises, by which I mean articles and the contact reports, etc., as written in the old predictions in the library on Era. I think, however, that the writings, as is just stated, are to be given directly to those of both sexes who are interested. By this, I understand that in this respect there is talk of your books and other writings, which unfortunately, due to the high costs of production, can only be given away for a certain appropriate fee, that is to say, for a certain price, because everything on earth depends on it. You should not get rich, but the expenses must be covered if everything is to continue. The information in the librarian predictions is also kept in such a way that the emergence of a religion or religious similarity from the community brought into being by you is to be avoided. Consequently, only Earth's human beings are to be accepted into it who are able to open their consciousness in intellect and reason for the effective truth and search for it, just as they are also willing to banish everything religious and sectarian from their thoughts and consciousness through their own decision. Thus, via the internet, the necessary information material should actually be disseminated for reading, nothing more, for it should not be animating, but informative and in such a way that the Earth human reading this information begins to cultivate independent thoughts, and thus, in the course of time, finds the effective truth, which is arranged very far from any religiosity and sectarianism. Mouth-to-ear information is also to be done, through which those Earth humans will become aware of the teaching who really want to think for themselves and find the way to the teaching. However, everything should not be such that it amounts to a conviction, but everything should always only be informative. Consequently, it should only appeal to those Earth humans who understand and know how to use their intellect and reason independently and are therefore not believers. That is what it says in the predictions and instructions I have received from the library so far.
Contact Report 782.
To get to know the terrain and recreate in it, as we educate all of our peoples and also our federated peoples that we are in contact with you in this universe, and where you bring the teaching that we do not withhold from our peoples and all peoples of the Federation.
I did not know that. Billy, I actually did not know that.
You also do not ask a lot of questions.
That is just the way it is. I know that you teach the teaching to your peoples, but that the Federation peoples are also involved in this way, as well as that you have our center with them. Well, that is the way it is. But what do you think about the question that I was asked on the phone the other day, and that is apparently circulating as an opinion among certain people, namely that certain people think, which I find erroneous, that we of the Figu have the task of saving Earth's humanity?
Such an assertion is nonsensical, because you yourself know very well what the task of the Figu Association and the teaching is, which has nothing to do with such an idea. That you fulfill your task and mission with the human beings on Earth, that has a completely different meaning.
Of course, because we of the Figu are not here to save the world, but to address individual human beings who are not lowly, intelligent, and therefore capable of thinking, and who are devoted to the effective truth, and are willing to learn more independently for the sake of their intellect and their reason, and also to do something to spread the truth to their own kind. In this way, through the work of the Figu and the teaching, only a small community shall arise worldwide, which can gradually help this and that human being to find and learn the truth of independent thinking. In the process, low intelligence, that is to say non-thinking, should be discarded in order to walk through the world with a clear mind. The purpose of all this is that in time, which will take a very long time, thousands of years, the humanity of the Earth will begin to think for itself, and thus move away from its religious and other beliefs in order to finally become peaceful. This is to be done by the time of the year 3999, after which, well, yes, you know. Everything does not have to be said publicly, because it is enough that I have agreed to retrieve and write down the contact reports, that is to say, the conversations that have taken place, in order to spread them. This at least those that you find important.
Yes, the whole thing will really take a long time, because that, which has been done for thousands of years by Earth humans for deities that do not exist, and that such are believed in and are in truth nothing but confused products of fantasy, cannot be changed overnight to truth, to sensible and independent thinking. The fact that Earth humans worship imaginary gods that have been fantasized is the result of false interpretations of natural phenomena that arose thousands of years ago as a result of false assumptions and have been preserved ever since. These, however, changed their form again and again, and have also changed again and again in the new time of the 21st century after Emmanuel, when new sects with new beliefs have appeared. This also happens many times today, but they quickly disappear again, just as they emerge. A phenomenon of belief in higher powers, which arises almost daily, but dissolves again as quickly as it has formed, has become such in the civilized world as does not even occur among the so-called primitives who live far from any civilization in the dense jungle. The whole belief in a god or otherwise in a higher power, which is supposed to determine the destiny of Earth humans and which they are supposedly unable to avoid, cannot be changed again so quickly and normalized in such a way as the whole thing has arisen. The belief, and thus the stupidity, that is, the non-thinking and the resulting faith in every respect, cannot be dissolved again as quickly as everything came into being. And to let independent thinking, decision-making, and action again become the order of Earth humans, as well as to eradicate again all the nonsense of the general faith in daily life, but especially of the religious faith in a God, God Creator, God Father, God All-Director, and God All-Determiner, requires much patience on the part of those who are active in spreading the truth. And above all, the whole process of enlightenment requires a great deal of time. For the truth does not want to be heard by Earth humans, for only rarely does anyone really want to turn to thinking and use it to think about what is really truth and what is imagination and misleading belief, and therefore untruth. For the majority of Earth humans, since the advent of faith, it has become a habit to wallow in stupidity, that is to say, in non-thinking, and thus in faith of every kind, and especially in religious faith in a God.
What unfortunately has been lost for millennia, and so the belief factor of all kinds has eaten into it not only religiously in a dear God, but generally and habitually. So it will also take millennia, unfortunately, until faith, mainly religious but also in daily life in general, disappears again through the use of understanding and reason. Until then, however, much disaster will befall humanity, and there will be wars and destruction such as never before. First and foremost, faith must disappear and be dissolved through our very own conscious and clear thinking, so that human beings no longer go along believing in a God in a lowly, intelligent, and simple-minded way, but go along thinking for themselves, making their own decisions, and therefore also acting in a rational and simple-minded way, in accordance with the correctness of truth. Actually, it is none of the Plejarians and Nokodemions' successors' business. But when about 25 million years ago or so, the old Plejarian discovered the energy gate to our space-time continuum and penetrated through it into this Dern universe, the explorers finally reached Earth. And so it happened that millions of years later, a Nokodemion successor also came to Earth and settled there. Furthermore, when the actual ancestors of the first human beings developed 12 million years ago, contrary to the confused assertions of earthly science and the falsifications of Darwin that the human being of the Earth only developed 3 million years ago, then millions of years later a descendant, that is to say a rebirth of the Nokodemion, found it necessary, when he saw all the misery that had arisen as a result of the religious and other beliefs of the Earthlings, to take care of the well-being of the human beings. Therefore, it is necessary today to bring the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life to the Earthlings. In doing so, it is necessary to find and address the few human beings who are still capable of a sound mind and clear reason, and unfortunately there are only a few of them, and moreover they are scattered all over the world, in order to bring them the truth through the teaching, and gradually lead them through it to conscious self-thinking, self-deciding, and self-acting. For this I have chosen, I hope, the correct way, via the spiritual doctrine, that is to say, the doctrine of creation, which I have also worked out for you with more than 12,000 typewritten pages.
I do not understand this comprehensively, just about Nokodemion and his rebirths, because I am not versed in history, just as I am not versed in when and why the ancient Plejaren first came into this universe. But what you have worked for us, what we have been able to pass on to all peoples, also to our federates, that—
It is good. You do not have to say it, because I already know what you want to say again. But that is not necessary, because it is my work, and there is no need to talk about it. The only thing that is important is that the duty is done and bears fruit, even if it is only a few at first. Unfortunately, it is so on Earth that many human beings are interested in the new and take hold of it, but then jump off again, because on the one hand learning, and on the other hand putting what has been learned into practice in life, is very laborious, and moreover, can only be realized with difficulty in this world. For this reason, many people lose courage over time or acquire ambitions that they want to assert and do not want to fit into the modesty that is needed to be able to confront fellow human beings in modesty, and thus not in any wise in an arrogant manner. Being self-important and arrogant and imagining oneself to be more, better and cleverer than fellow human beings, which unfortunately is just another form of belief, brings nothing of value, but only failure and anger, and moreover untruth and enmity, as well as failure and disappointment. Unfortunately, this is not understood, which is why many a human being of the earth exalts himself and in time wants to direct himself over fellow human beings, which usually leads to the bondage of others or to enmity. Making up wild fantasies, these are believed as reality by those who have got stuck in them, with which hatred is built up over time, and lies are invented in such a way that the beams bend with shame. This inevitably leads to the fact that the truth is no longer seen, and the finish line is drawn, which, however, also has the consequence that the human beings of Earth then work unconsciously and full of hatred against the truth, and imagine the lies and fantasies as reality, and defend them mendaciously. And he then does this without even knowing that he lives in a fantasy-rich web of lies that he has somehow bent into shape for himself, for which the personal fantasies can be manifold, and so imaginary, that it is no longer possible to distinguish between the fantasy and reality. The end of the song is then that he separates himself and leaves the path of righteousness, and turns away from and abandons what has been laboriously worked out by reason and understanding. The fact that he then still complains and passes on his wild fantasies as reality to his listeners, etc., inevitably creates discord and even hatred. In this way, the human being of the earth gives himself up again to what is also hammered into him elsewhere by his own faith mill, namely, what he believes anchored in himself.
It must be learned to be able to explain this. Experience, learning are necessary to understand this and also to be able to formulate it in an explanatory manner. But if I may say that I do not know the story of Nokodemion as well as you do, then I must confess that I shame myself with it. After all, in my task I am supposed to stand by you and be helpful to you. For this I should actually know what has happened with Nokodemion and his direct successors. Exactly that, however, I do not know.
You do not? Then let it be explained that precisely what happened was determined by Nokodemion, and thus the following resulted. It happened in such a way that later, but it was many millions of years, a successor, that is to say a rebirth of Nokodemion, became interested in this planet Earth, namely as human life emerged on it, from which then, in the course of development and wrong interpretation, a belief in deities developed. When Nokodemion's successor came to Earth and found that the Earthlings had become believers in deities, which, even then, had produced terrible blossoms, the belief in deities was already so deeply anchored in the Earthlings that it was recognizable that in later times tremendous harm would arise from it. This has indeed been the case throughout the ages since then, and it is still the case today, because everything of faith has been preserved in religious terms and in general, and human beings have lost their conscious thinking. So he has fallen prey to low intelligence, which is non-thinking and not a damage to consciousness, or otherwise a defect of an organic nature in the brain. A fact that even today, in the so-called enlightened age, neuroscience has neither recognized nor, as a result of ignorance, been able to explain to the Earthlings. The delusion of faith led to human beings being cruelly murdered and offered as human sacrifices to imaginary gods in order to appease them, to expect good harvests or to wage wars victoriously, and so on. This gave rise to various religions with cruel rites and murderous customs, such as the murderous Kali sect in India, then also the Assassins as an Islamic sect, as well as others who are up to their murderous mischief today, such as the IS, that is to say the Islamist State, and then also the Taliban, as well as others who belong to Christianity and carry out murders that are never solved, as is the case, for example, with a well-known American sect. And more everything developed into religions, which quickly gave rise to a hatred of faith directed against those of other faiths and against human beings who were inconvenient for others, and who were innocently accused of all evil and even of being in league with the devil. In this way, religious belief of all kinds was mercilessly carried on through murder and manslaughter, as was expressed in the Middle Ages, especially through the murder of witches, but as is still the case at all times to this day, about which public silence is maintained. War, hatred, stabbing, persecution, and murder of many people of other faiths, however, is still today the consequence of, mainly, religious faith, which is practiced, just as mainly, by fanatics who believe in Islam. And this was not enough, because through the whole of faith, the most diverse gods and finally the many gods of Hinduism, such as mainly Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Ganapati, and many others, as well as the divine principle Brahman, came into being. Then there were the ancient Greeks with their gods. They called the chief god Zeus, then Athena, Poseidon, Eris, Aphrodite, Helen, and Apollo. But there were also Demeter, Artemis, Ares, and Hermes, as well as Hestia and Hephaistos. With the Jews, Yahweh functions as God. With the Christians, it is the God and his allegedly incarnate son Jesus, the Savior, who was actually called Emmanuel and had nothing to do with an imaginary God, but only brought the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, with Islam then Allah. There are other female and male deities existing today in faith and fantasy en masse, depending on religion and sect, which are simply impossible to list, because the whole religious nonsense of such imaginary religious fantasy figures is far too extensive and changes practically from day to day. Today this and that religious sect exists. Tomorrow it is already gone, while already a new one is causing the believers to go crazy again. This religious nonsense of the earthlings, that is to say, the human beings of the earth, led to the fact that quarrels arose between the different believers. Consequently, people fought about the religions and their deities, and hatred arose against the neighbor who worshipped another deity, and consequently had another faith, which led to murder and manslaughter and finally to war and destruction. So, because of religions and different beliefs, religious wars have arisen again and again since time immemorial, claiming millions and millions of human lives. And these are still raging underground today, and will continue in this wise for a long time, mainly between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Again and again there are murders and assassinations because of this, because religious fanatics strike and blow human beings of other faiths to shreds or shoot them, stab them, beat them to death, or massacre them. It is,